Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, everyone, welcome back to Nets in the Water. Today, we're here with Nick Tanis. Nick is the principal at a very solid, I think almost renowned elementary school in Tampa, Christ the King. You've been there for how many years now?
This is the beginning of my 13th year.
Wow. Okay, he's been there for 13 years. It's a pre-K through 8th grade attached to, it's kind of one of the premier elementary schools in the diocese, attached to one of the premier parishes, attached to one of the premier towns.
It's a lot of accolades for
I got to throw it all out there
expectation
first.
to live up to.
Exactly. We start it high and then we just ride that wave. We keep that momentum going. It's perfect. So Nick, thank you so much for being on today. I'm really excited to have you here.
Sure. Great to be here and happy to do whatever we can to do God's work.
Yeah, no, it's really fun stuff. So you've been a principal now for 13 years. You're going into your 13th, so you've been in for 12. Were you teaching beforehand? I can only assume you were teaching Catholic school beforehand. Were you doing public school before that? What's your background story?
So Christ the King is actually my first kind of foray into Catholic education.
Okay.
Except for when I went to Christ the King as a student. So my family moved down from Chicago when I was 8 years old. So I started at Christ the King in 1986 as a third grader in Miss Federico's class, and our family became parishioners, and it's really been my parish ever since that time. I graduated from Plant High School here in Tampa and then went to UCF, University of Central Florida, go Knights, and from there went into teaching. I was a language arts teacher. I taught in public school, Randall Middle School and Coleman Middle School down here in South Tampa, and then went in the administration route, but through public school. Became an assistant principal, worked out at Bartels, which is now Turner K-8 out in New Tampa, and then came down to Wilson as the assistant principal as well.
Okay. That's a nice list. You got a lot of
some good experience.
A lot of Tampa
there.
love. Yeah, a lot of Tampa experience. So what prompted your transition then from public school to Catholic school?
So as I said, Christ the King had remained my parish when we came back down, or when I graduated from college, and as I started my wife and I started having children, I started feeling a little bit more called to do more within our parish. So that started small. I became a lector at our parish, but then kept having this feeling of, is there something more? Is there more that I should be doing? And was actually considering potentially like a path in the diaconate, and talked to the pastor at the time, who was Father Toops, now Monsignor, actually now Bishop Toops, and he said, well, you're married, you've got a young family. I'm not sure being a deacon is the route for you right now. Maybe when your kids are older, maybe when you're a little bit older, that might be a calling for you. He said, but have you ever thought about using your gifts and talents as an educator in Catholic education? And that was just kind of one of those moments where, the obvious answer is just laying right there in front of you. And it had never been anything that I had even considered, even though being, strong Catholic, regularly practicing Catholic, but being in public school, never really thought about crossing over. And I couldn't give you a reason as to why. It just was never out there. But then, as soon as he said that, it was like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. And, while I had been in public school as an administrator and, looking to become a principal in a public school, the assistant principal position at Christ the King kept coming open. And I would know about it because my wife at the time, Courtney, she worked at Christ the King as a 5th grade teacher and then as a kindergarten teacher. And every time it came open, she's like, oh, you should consider that. I'm like, no, I'm on this path. And public school, this is kind of my path. This is where I'm going. And then shortly after I had the conversation with Monsignor Toops, or Bishop Toops, sorry, then the position came open again. And it was at that point that I'm like, okay, this has got to be something more than, exactly. Yeah. It's got to be something more than just a coincidence. So I talked to the principal at the time, Jared Carrier, and he kind of laid out his plan for. He's like, look, I think I'm going to be here another 2 years, then I'm going to retire, and obviously, what I would love is for you to come in as the assistant principal, and let's see where it goes. If it's a position you'd want to step into as principal, certainly the opportunity would be there, and that's been my journey.
That's awesome. So you transitioned out of public school teaching into the Catholic school world. How did the transition work from public to Catholic school? Did you always see your public school teaching as a spiritual endeavor, or did it kind of become that once you started at Christ the King, or did you kind of discover it to be one once you were at Christ the King for some time? What was that like, kind of the timeline of those two realities? How'd those converge?
Well, I think that even in my public school life, I do think that I was able to bring my faith into my workplace. I mean, my all of the principals I had, like, jokingly would say, well, of course that's what you think, Nick, you're a good little Catholic boy. So it's it was lovingly said that way. So I think especially when I was as an administrator, although you couldn't really be as upfront, honest, and open about your faiths and your beliefs, it can certainly influence your actions and the way you deal with, especially as an assistant principal in a public school who mostly dealt with student affairs. You certainly could bring loving compassion and loving kindness into your encounters and interactions with the students and with their parents. And that's something that I was able to do. But it wasn't until that I came into Catholic school where I really felt like you could educate the whole child, because that is something that a lot of schools, secular, private, public, Catholic, Christian, all will say, our goal is to educate the whole child. Yeah. In a public school, that is, usually the social emotional parts, it's the academic parts, it's the behavioral parts. But it wasn't really until I came to work at Christ the King that I felt like we really were able to educate the whole child, because we could never really talk about that spiritual component. Yeah. And, in a Catholic school, we really are educating the whole child, because it is social emotional, it is behavior, it is academic, but it's also spiritual. And that is one thing that I didn't realize it was missing as much as I did then when I became the principal or really assistant principal at Christ the King at that time. Yeah,
I think something that's been becoming more clear to me as I continue to talk to educators through this, but I'm not one, is that even outside of the explicitly spiritual aspects of teaching in a Catholic school, all teaching it's a deeply Catholic thing for teaching to be a spiritual endeavor. Like, to come to know truth is something that inherently evokes Christ, evokes the Lord. Like, he made the truth. So all teaching becomes Catholic through teaching truth, but for it to become an explicit thing is kind of when it switches from being a covertly Catholic thing to an overtly Catholic thing. And that's when I feel like the nuance, the depth of Catholic education comes into play, which is what you're talking about, this idea of the whole person. And I think you kind of mentioned this idea before we were starting today, but yeah, in all education, you are doing God's work. Right. But it is when you make that transition into Catholic school that you're now also, in a weird way, working for God, which is a beautiful calling, but I'd imagine is a somewhat difficult one to keep balanced. Yeah, in a way that's honest to the will of the Lord.
It is, and there's so many different aspects of it, and it's really something that even within the last, ever since I've been in Catholic education, that I've always just kind of been wrestling with that, because I think when you work in a secular environment, you almost have to be intentional, or you definitely have to be intentional about where and how your faith plays a role in that. So you think about it more. When you work in an environment, a different kind of thing. So when you work in an environment that is Catholic, like, you certainly are thinking about the Catholic faith, but your actions may not be as intentional, but because you take for granted the fact that you work in a Catholic school. For example, we know, like you said, we know that our work is is in helping uncover the truth. We know that our vocation is to teach the young. But when we're in a Catholic school, we might just take for granted the fact that, well, that's just what I do. So, just my normal workings of the day are, I'm going to, because I work in a Catholic school, I'm obviously going to be teaching the Catholic faith. Whereas if you are not working in that environment, you might think a little bit more about, okay, when I answer this question or when I answer this email, am I showing my faith in my response? So I think that's where sometimes when you work for God, you might take for granted the fact that you're working for God, so you might not put as much effort into doing or acting in a way that it's Catholic, because you think it's just going to happen naturally, if that makes sense.
That does. It's very counterintuitive, but it makes sense what you're saying, because I would think that, oh, now I'm at a Catholic school, it's all easier to kind of live out, I can be obvious about it, but it makes total sense with what you're saying. Was that what your experience was like? Would you say that it was, you almost had a difficulty spiritualizing what you were doing? Maybe I'm off, but it sounds like you're saying that you almost had a difficulty spiritualizing your work at a Catholic school more so than a public one in your day-to-day, not conceptually so much, I'm sure.
I think that's part of it, but it's also just those little practices of prayer. For example, at school, we start each day with prayer. We do the Angelus midday. We'll pause and do a prayer at the end of the day. So if I ask most people, hey, do you pray 3 times a day? Like, no. They're like, oh, we pray 3 times a day. But because it happens every day and it's something that we put on, it's very easy to tune it out. Whereas if you're sitting at your desk and you have that noon reminder goes off, you have to stop what you're doing in your workplace, whether you're lawyer, accountant, doctor, driving a truck. Like, you're stopping, making that intentional practice of saying the angels. Like, you're actively doing that and making the choice to say that prayer rather than, okay, guys, quiet down, announcements are coming on. And then, Angelus is happening. You're kind of looking around, making sure that the kids are all paying attention. And, maybe you've got a kid squirming around. He's got to come sit with you. So that's what I mean by, when you're working for God, you're surrounded by all of these spiritual things, but it's also very easy to take them for granted. Or then you get home and you're like, I prayed at the end of the day today. I don't, I'm good. Now I can focus on this other thing. I've spent my 8 hours today devoted to God. Now I can go home and I can spend these, this hour scrolling through social media or, watching a movie. I think sometimes it's easy to let that be an excuse to be a little bit, lax in and again, it may not lax, but it's you give yourself more permission to take a break. Whereas if you spent all day working in an environment that is devoid of any kind of Catholicism or spirituality, you might go home and feel like, oh, I really need this. So you make the time at home, or you make the time outside of work to, have those spiritual practices.
It almost, the way you're describing it, reminds me of saying something like saying the Our Father, where it's more difficult for me to say the Our Father prayerfully now because I've done it so much, as opposed to a prayer from the top of my head, or someone who doesn't know the Our Father, where it registers more because it's a particular thing. But as the idea of Catholic education becomes more normal, it just becomes harder to, it almost sounds like keep the zeal for it. It almost sounds like you just kind of begin to the flame burns so hot when you're not in that environment, because there's something that's almost on guard inside of you, or at least wanting to come out. Whereas when the flame is kind of in the open, it sounds like it almost is harder to keep it stoked.
Right. Totally understand that. And that's why you have to intentionally plan some prayer or some other practices outside of what you're doing within your school day. so I think that's something that's important for people. When you were talking about that before, there used to be an old expression that was even predated my time, and they called it like a busman's holiday, which, again, fact check if you need this one, but the term came from the fact that, like, people that drove a bus never could really go on a holiday or take a vacation because they would inevitably, before, you'd have to ride in a car, ride in a bus, or ride in something on to take your vacation. So, if all you're doing is used to sitting around driving in a bus all day, it's not a vacation for you to be driven in a bus around by somebody else, because you're always thinking about what's going on. So I imagine like, I wonder about sacristans. Like, can sacristans really, how do they enjoy Mass? Because they spend so much time preparing for Mass. Like, if they're sitting in a Mass, are they looking at, are they able to, take their eyes off, oh, well, that chalice should have been over there. I can see the priest really wanted that, that altar server to bring the candles at that time. I wonder if it's hard for them to turn that off. And I know that even sometimes for me, we have, our Wednesday, we have our Wednesday Mass at school, and that's something that we do once a week. But during that Mass, that's a time where I'm usually making sure that the kids are behaving. I'm checking to make sure that they're not talking or causing disruption, that they're being reverent. It's that, does a teacher need to bring his child out because they're sick, and then we're going to walk them over to the nurse. So there's a lot of logistical parts to that I'm kind of overseeing, so that the kids and that the teachers can enjoy Mass. And then it gets hard to do that. It gets hard to turn that off sometimes on Sundays, although I'm not in charge of the children, despite the fact that I don't know how many times I've heard parents whisper to their child, "Oh, that's Mr. Tanis back there. You need to make sure you stand up straight because he's standing back there." Like, I'm going to, I can't discipline their children during Sunday Mass. But even though that's not my
really
role on
funny
Sundays, it's still something that I'm looking, I'm still looking for, okay, who's behaving, what's going in, what's coming out. So sometimes it's hard to turn that off. So again, that goes back to that concept of, like, when you're working for God, it can be hard work.
Yeah, it reminds me of for context, one of my favorite things to do on this show is poorly quote other things that I've read one chapter of. It reminds me of this G.K. Chesterton quote, though, that basically summates to like God rejoices in the monotony of every day, whereas we are burdened by it. It basically is like, well, perhaps God is excited to make every flower the same by hand, and to say to the sun, rise again every day. And it sounds very similar to what you're saying with Catholic education, that you have to almost learn to rejoice in the monotony, the regularity of the life of a Catholic educator in order to be able to do it well. Or else you'll just get jaded and take it for granted and not know how to separate work from leisure in something that, isn't work. The spiritual life shouldn't feel like work. But to be able to separate it almost takes an ability to rejoice in the monotony of doing it every day.
Right. And this might not be everyone's experience in Catholic education, or I just might be really poor at praying outside of my work life, because I would imagine, and I feel like once you get that spiritual consolation from God, it doesn't feel like work anymore. But I do think that, for me at least, I've got to be very intentional about how I schedule my own prayer time outside of school. So in some ways, like, what I do at work, it's work. And then, I need to make sure that I'm scheduling time and setting aside time for developing my own relationship with God that's outside of what I'm doing during the workday. And I think it's also, for those of us in Catholic education, it is being more aware of the different opportunities we have during the school day. And this could be particularly a challenge for people that come from public school into a Catholic education. So I really just kind of, as we're talking, really thought about how maybe it's that, when you're used to such a routine and a way of doing things when you're in a public school, that, then when you go to Catholic school, well, this is just what I do during, when it's my lunchtime. These are the things that I typically get done during lunch. Like, I check an email, I'll check in with my partner teacher, and those are all good things to do. But if your lunch happens to be at 12, from like 12 to 12:40, and daily mass is going on at 12:10, maybe you're just not even thinking about that as something to do during lunch. And embarrassing confession would be, it's my 13th year as principal, outside of going to, there's 12:10 daily mass at Christ the King every day. Of those, during the times I've been principal, I've been to daily mass at 8 a.m. on Wednesday, and maybe once have I gone to 12:10 mass during the school year. So it's like one of those things, like every day I can be with the Lord and receive the Eucharist at 12:10 every day, Monday through Friday. And you take it for granted. And again, that's, right. Typically that's when our 7th and 8th graders have lunch and recess. So I can excuse to myself that, I don't go because I need to make sure I'm here for this lunch and recess for these students. You'd think that if I was a good enough principal, I'd have enough leadership and people in place that I could take a 12:10 mass once a while and again. So it's like, so this coming school year, on my calendar on Thursdays, at 12:10 mass.
That's awesome.
Like I had to calendar it because it's important enough to me that I've made it a goal for myself. Look, you have to get daily mass outside of school mass at least once a week as a start. Yeah. So I've had to calendar that time. I've got to tell my office coordinator, look, this is a time, don't schedule an observation, don't schedule a parent phone call. Like, this is a time where I'm going to hold that sacred. Now I know that teachers, your administrators are giving you your schedule, and they're the ones that are, dictating when your times off are. But again, maybe it's not the mass. I'm sure if you're in Catholic education, there's a chapel, that's a church, there's something on your campus where, you could spend some of that time with our Lord. And I think if we don't schedule that time on again, especially as a teacher, you get some teachers don't get a break all day. Our teachers are fortunate enough that in most cases they have, a lunch break where they are spending time. They're spending a lot of that with their kids, especially in elementary. And then they have 2 different 40-minute breaks throughout the day. So again, as a teacher, you're taking those 40-minute breaks. You've got parent emails to check. You've got, administrative emails to check. You've got conferences and phone calls. So, I could imagine I almost could feel the eye rolls of saying, well, can't you just take 10 minutes out of that time to spend in the chapel? They're like, well, yeah, maybe if you gave me 10 extra minutes, I could. But that's, again, I think if you are feeling some, spiritual desolation, if you are in a spot where you feel like you need to put more into your prayer life, like, you give God 5 minutes, he's going to find you 5 hours. Like he's going to find you that time. And, ultimately when it's all said and done is the extra 5 minutes to check one more email more valuable to you than 5 minutes with our Lord. And that's a long, I can say that now, but it's not, it's still hard to practice it every day. Totally. And I think it's having that be at the forefront of your mind is the only way that you can get a little bit better at that.
And it sounds like it serves almost as a mini retreat in the day to break like the regularity of it. That like by removing yourself from the conveyor belt of work, you can kind of recenter yourself on the 2 levels of it, of like work and spiritual life. And it's like by pausing this top line of work, you almost allow the bottom line throughout the whole day to get risen up to a world that's like separate, but also tied one and the same to what you're doing, but stays as fresh as it ought to be.
And exactly. And for some of our teachers, most of our, teachers are typically, they have families, and outside of taking care of other people's children for that 8 hours of the day, they go home and they've got to meal prep. They've got to help their own kids with their homework. Yeah. They've got to take care of their own, fitness needs and take care of their own food needs. So there isn't a lot of time at home. So in some cases, if you plan that little mini retreat during the day, during, a time that you have open, that might be the only time you have that day. That is yours. That's not dedicated to somebody else that you are responsible for taking care of. And I think, most people, none of our teachers want to abdicate their responsibilities at home for their families, and will often always almost put their family's needs in front of their own. So, take that time during the school day to feed your own spiritual needs, because again, you might not get that at home.
Yeah. And I think that's what it means to I think that shows the necessity of prayer in doing God's work. That's kind of the theme of this, doing God's work when you work for God. That in order to work for God well and to do his work well, like it necessitates a firm spiritual life first for the rest of the work to flow out of. Because if not, like you can't do any good works for the Lord without prayer first, without your own relationship with the Lord. Like, how am I going to give something that I don't have?
Right. And I think that it's, with at Christ the King, I think one of the things that makes our community special at the school is this idea of the Salesian charism. So, I would be remiss not to talk about St. John Bosco when I have the opportunity on any platform.
Oh, it makes me happy.
When I was a student at Christ the King, we had the Daughters of Mary Help of Christians, the Salesian sisters who were there, and they had a huge impact on me and my upbringing. And so, while the sisters are no longer at Christ the King, we still are very faithful to St. John Bosco and the whole Salesian charism. And the idea of Sister Mary Mazzarello, and this idea that doing work, just general work, can be an offering to God. I mean, and that was one of the things that, we talked to the students about. Again, you may misquote, chapters and books you read. I will misquote and mangle stories of people. Not too terribly, but I usually get the general crux of it. And, that was one of the things that we tell our kids about, Mary Mazzarello, is that, she was a tenacious worker. I mean, and worked outside, hot sun, in the field, and, people would be taking a break, and then she'd still go out and work, and they'd say, well, why are you working? She's like, well, no work ever got done in the shade. And she would always offer up her work to God. So I think, one of those ways that we can also, further baptize the work we do for God when we work for him is to offer up those little things, as we suffer an injustice during the day when, a student doesn't follow a direction that we gave them, or we get, a scathing email from a parent, you can offer that up to God. And in some ways you can make that a prayer. And that's one of those ways where you don't necessarily have to carve out any extra time to do things, but it is being mindful in the moment that, look, I'm doing this for a reason. I'm gonna offer this up to God so that there's purpose in this. There's purpose in this suffering. So I think that's something that we can do as Catholic educators too, is remember that, when we are doing our work, we can offer it up to God, even the parts of it that might not be as pleasant for us throughout the day.
Yeah, it's just a change in disposition. I really like the phrase that you used, to baptize the day.
Which seems odd that you'd have to baptize anything in a Catholic school or Catholic environment, but
what do you mean by that? By baptize the day?
It kind of, again, going back to, it's funny. I use the term, probably overuse the term, baptize things, because there are, a lot of things that we'll sometimes, we'll borrow from secular culture, and we'll say, well, that's a great idea, but we're gonna baptize it and give it kind of like our own Catholic spin. Like there's this, I know I'm going way off from where your question is, but this is just an example of it. Is one of the things we're doing in this upcoming school year is working on, helping our students with executive functioning. So one of the things one of the strategies is, to stop, to think, to plan, and then do. So if, sometimes if a student is having trouble sitting still or having trouble behaving, you've got these little visuals where it's, stop what you're doing, think about what you're doing. Is that what you're supposed to be doing? Is it not what you're supposed to be doing? Okay, what's your plan to get back on track to do what you need to do, and then do it. So as I was, talking about this with my, assistant principal and the consultant that we're working with, I was like, oh, we can baptize that. We can put the word prayer in the middle of it. So it's, stop, think, pray, plan, do. So, we've got this posters that we made, and we're, have them up over the school, and we'll give them to the teachers, and then we'll have those up so that it's, again, that's kind of like baptizing that. So back to the original question, like how do you, what do I mean by doing that in your day, is that, sometimes in any part of our day, there's usually some kind of suffering, angst,
totally
something. But I think we oftentimes forget that there's, God's trying to teach us something through that. And I guess what I mean by that is, instead of just focusing on the negative thing or focusing on, the thing that is bothering us, remembering that there's a higher purpose to this. There's a reason that God is putting this in my life. I listen to, Father Mike Schmitz a lot and his Sunday homilies, and he's like, in one of the ones he had over the summer, it's like, don't let that suffering go to waste. It's like, so let God do something with it. So that's kind of what I mean by baptizing those, those mundane tasks.
Like letting
you might
God
think, right? You might
the
think
day
it's just
for
a
good.
mundane task, but baptize it, give it to God.
Yeah. What do you think the Lord is going to do for you based off of the suffering of doing this podcast? Do you have like an intention that you're...
I'm hoping that it's at least going to be some time off of purgatory.
Yeah, I'm a $2 million donations for. Yeah,
I mean, that's
beautiful.
Odd thing I heard that was also from one of those podcasts is like, and this was a Father Mike thing. He's like, I'd be joyous if I went to purgatory because I know I made it there.
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
He's like, I'm going to get there eventually.
Yeah, we're good. We made it. We're done. You just got to get through purgatory. I don't know if it terrifies me or if it comforts me that there's no time in purgatory. Because I don't know if that means it's going to feel really long or really short. I don't know what that means. Probably this is when we do the heresy part of the podcast. When I was talking earlier about the heresy part, we can speculate about purgatory, and then that's perfect. That'll get us super checked off by the USCCB.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that we speculate about purgatory here. No, I really like that idea though of baptizing the day, because I think that's something that it's a really beautiful reality in the cross that Jesus didn't die so that we wouldn't suffer, but he died so that we wouldn't suffer in vain. And within that is he died so that we wouldn't do anything in vain. Nothing that we do has to be in vain. And that, it seems like you're alluding to, like, that's the key to how to do God's work when you work for God. Like, that's the silver bullet of, like, if you're able to offer up what you're doing to the Lord as a sacrifice, then you're on the track. You're doing it. The train's moving towards the station.
Sure.
In order to do that well. Do you think that's like step one of it? Do you think that's maybe part one of it, part one of 14? Like what are your thoughts on that?
I think step one is really pausing in your day. And really the first step is to recognize some of those moments. And I know that, but sometimes it's hard because if you're caught in the middle of a moment, it's hard to stop and pull back.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think as it becomes more of a habit and a routine, like step one is recognizing those small moments throughout the day. I mean, for me, step one is really, and again, how I operate is I need to plan things and I need to have them kind of scheduled so that they become a routine and a habit. So like step one for me has always been, well, let me figure out when am I going to have this time throughout the day. I mean, I think you have to do that first because I don't think it's not without that habit of prayer that you can start recognizing God in the small moments throughout the day, or get to the point where you can offer up any of your sufferings for him. Like you just don't do that. We just don't do that naturally. That's usually not the default for most people.
Yeah,
so
totally.
I think you kind of have to figure out when you're going to spend your time with God. And I think that's been an important thing for me over the last few years is really, even if it's 5 minutes, even if it's 10, fit 10, like build it up. It is just taking and carving out some time for yourself to be with God. And sometimes not just, not praying in the sense that we sometimes think of, I'm just going to fill this space with my words. It's sometimes just stopping and sitting and listening. And I will say that can be a prayer. And I would advise any educators out there, you can find 2 minutes, 60 seconds during your free time to just sit, stop, listen. And this is something that Rob says all the time. See, I threw that in there.
Perfect.
I tried to throw that in there just to get him.
Yeah, I hope everyone is confused. Rob only technically exists.
Correct. It's like I mean, he's your boss, right? So he's like the Schrodinger's boss. He both exists and doesn't exist at the same time.
He's
for you.
a Lovecraftian boss. That's how we do it.
But he would always. I mean, I think one of the prayers he would always say is this. You can fact check. I think it was Samuel. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.
Yep. Yeah, it's at the beginning of.
Like, I'm not a Baptist minister where I can like pull up Proverbs and words.
I'm super out on that.
Throw them.
I only know it because it's kind of my job to know it.
Impressed by people that can, and like would love to get there someday, but that's just not me.
You just got to get a couple general ones you can pull out as party tricks.
Exactly.
It's like I got early Genesis 3:15. It's a fun little party trick, and I'm out. I can do that one. I learned it in high school, and I'm going to pivot, and we're good.
But you can never hang out with the same people then, because like, oh, here he comes.
Genesis. Yeah, here comes Genesis 3:15 guy. Yeah, no, I do. They get sick of it, but they'll all memorize it.
But so again,
back to speak, Lord, your servant.
It's a very, very short. You say it, and you just listen. You just sit and you listen, and probably more times than not, you're just going to get silence back. But again, I think about our own teachers who are moms or dads who are going to leave, well past the time the bell rings, and they're going to go home and they're going to get right on. You talked about the train. They're going to jump on the family train track of, after school activities for their own kids, feeding their own kids, studying with their own kids. They're not going to have another silent minute to themselves until they go to bed. Yeah. And by that time, they're just so exhausted. I mean, I don't know how many, people, decide that they do their prayers at the end of the night and they fall asleep. I mean, with a, rosary in their hand or with the beginning of a prayer, which is probably not a bad way to fall asleep.
Yeah. If there's something to do to fall asleep.
That is, again, it's just taking some of that time to just pause and to listen. So, that's been really helpful for me. Something I've tried to incorporate into my faith life versus, always just thinking that, okay, I've got to take this 30 minutes. I've got to fill it up with me just talking to God and just fill it up with prayers, just because a lot of us are just uncomfortable with silence too.
Yeah. Silence is a weird thing. It's fun. We were just talking about it around the office the other day. It's just such a funny concept. Like if you get silent, people just, it's weird. It's not human, but it is so human. I don't get it. I don't know things. So this is crazy.
Well, like we always, you think about that, like, riding in cars with my children over the summers, and my wife, we will always kind of like ask the would you rather question. Nice. And, one of the would you rather questions that always comes up is, would you, if you had to tomorrow lose your sight or lose your hearing, which one would it be? And my kids are always 100%, I'd rather lose my hearing than lose my sight. And I am always 100%, I'd rather lose my sight than lose my hearing, because the silence to me would be deafening.
Yeah.
I love music. I love to I feel like being alone with your own thoughts in silence would be a really, really scary place for me a lot of times. It's
also a huge indicator of dementia, which I'm just going to, I'll just pivot. I'll pivot away from being deaf if it means I'm not going to get dementia. I'm good on that. I was just talking to someone else about that. What would you say are, what was I going to say there?
The dementia thing was,
I thought we were going to keep going down there.
And now you're forgetting things. So.
Let's keep going down that rabbit hole. Oh, that's what I was about to say. When you're talking about silence, it's funny that you bring it up, because I used to have a teacher in middle school. He was my 6th grade homeroom teacher. And he would always do a prayer before class. And maybe once every month or two, he would just kind of go, all right, in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And he would just sit there in silence for like 30 seconds. And like some of us would kind of look around and like look at each other like, did he forget to pray? Did he fall asleep? And then he would just finish the prayer, and that'd be the end of it. And at the time I was like, this is so silly. He just wants us to shut up. But now I'm kind of like, oh, that was actually a really cool gesture. Like, that's a very beautiful prayer. It's just like, just sit for a little bit with the Lord. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Yeah, like allowing it to be a conversation. And that kind of, I think, ties back to the monotony of every day can be broken up so much with silence because there's so much noise in like, it's like almost like, I think of day-to-day things as like a droning noise in your ear where it's not that you always listen to it, but once you think about it or once it's turned off rather, you realize how quiet it is without it. It's like an air conditioner on.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a room with a loud air conditioner, you never notice
Right.
it and then it turns off and you're like, whoa, it's so quiet back here. I feel like it's a similar thing though in your day with these like mini retreats you're talking about, of going to mass, having personal prayer. It almost feels like you're turning off the loud AC unit of your day. And you have to be comfortable with it being off. You have to be comfortable with it being silent and just sitting with the Lord in silence. Or else then you're trying to make your own AC noise, trying to talk and talk and think and talk and overthink and go deeper. And it's like, no, just take a step back and be with the Lord.
Right. And there are so many other things out there to fill that.
Yeah.
To fill that noise. And, you know, we'll do the same thing with our students at morning assembly. Every now and again, one of us will, you know, at morning assembly, myself or the assistant principal or the priest will give a message to the students. We'll say any announcements. We'll do our pledge, our vision statement, our prayer, and then move on to class. And inevitably, one of us throughout the year will always just, you know, I kind of think of it as dialing in. If you don't have a message that day, it's just like, hey guys, we're just going to sit here in silence. and that's the message for the day. But even if it's just for 30 seconds, like after about 10, the kids they'll just start kind of looking at each other, and they just are not used to, even in that setting, just being and listening for silence. So it's definitely a practice we need to have. We need to instill more of in our own lives. And even if it's, like I said, just a minute, just to kind of to sit there and collect your own thoughts, try to hear what the Lord is telling you to do. I think that's important, because I think naturally we want to fill that silence. You know, like you said, if the air conditioner cuts off, I want to turn the radio on now.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, exactly.
I need some kind of noise in the background.
Yeah. It's something I'm trying to get better at doing as well, even just in my speech. Is like, all right, take some time, dude. Slow down. You're good. Like you can take a pause. And then in my day, to take it more on the spiritual warfare front too, like Satan is the loudest, most annoying piece of crap air conditioner you could imagine. like he speaks through noise where the Lord speaks through silence. The Satan never goes like, yeah, man, just think about it. And then like takes a step back. His tactic is like, throw it at you, hammer you. What about this? What about that? What about this fear? What about that apprehension? Whereas the Lord's language, often, not always, but it can just be like, think about it. Take some time. Be silent for a minute. And yeah, it's my reminder to myself, because we're just in a world that is noise is so readily available. I mean, even turning the clock back 200 years, whenever the radio was invented, before that.
Fact check.
Yeah, fact check. Whenever that was, I feel like life was just much more silent, probably. Like you didn't always have something on hand to make noise. You didn't always have something playing music around you. It was like, unless you left the house and went to a place that was like people were doing things, whenever you were walking to and from somewhere, it was probably relatively quiet. Whenever you got home, it was pretty quiet. I mean, with families, this is different, but it's a different type of noise. But I just almost think in envy to these times of less noise. And now how countercultural it is to like, if I get in a friend's car and they don't put music on, I think they're a psychopath. I think I'm in a car with Patrick Bateman. I'm like, dude, what do you mean? You're just going to sit in silence right now? But it's that's where the Lord wants to encounter us. And that's how you sanctify what you're doing, to bring it back. I'm kind of rambling here. I'll probably have Aiden cut some of this. But to bring it back to this idea of doing God's work when you work for God, like, in order to infuse God into it, you need some silence to let him speak. There's a quote somewhere in this office of St. Ignatius, another botched quote here. Let's do this. that like the Lord speaks in a whisper. And you need to learn how to make yourself quiet to hear his voice.
So there's like 9 things I want to talk about that you just went through.
Great. Perfect. I'm glad I just took way too much time to throw a bunch of stuff at you.
So the first one is the devil speaks in noise and God speaks in silence. Is that from somewhere? Is that a mismatched quote, or is that an original for you that you just kind of came up with on the spot?
Ooh, not on the spot, because I gave a talk on silence a couple years ago that I looked into stuff about. And I don't remember if I read it somewhere or if I made it up. I would be shocked if no one has said it before. So I'm not going to claim to have said it, but I think it was either one. I don't really remember, to be honest.
Because that was a good one. I'll definitely say, hey, I heard this on a podcast.
Yeah, this dumb kid who interviewed me said this.
And then I do think if there's, to keep joking about, like, I'm sure that there are more learned podcasts or things you could look at that
I'm sure
would tell you, I think, like, our brains have changed
much less of a heresy risk on those.
Based on the amount of information we would, they were consumed now. Again, I've heard multiple people reference multiple times, like, you watch the Andy Griffith show, which, if you guys are aware of what that show is, like old black and white, Opie and Anthony. Have you ever heard of that show before?
I've heard the name of the show, and then I was going to smile and laugh along just to kind of.
So, or like a Turner, or go like Turner Classic Movies. Like, you just watch something from like the black and white movie or television era.
I Love Lucy. Does that count?
Probably.
Does that count? Okay.
But you watch something from that era, and then you watch something from now, and count the number of seconds before there's a shift of the camera or a shift in the scene. And I'm sure that you guys probably look at through your own, when you're producing the Studio 316 episodes, you probably have been advised or looked at, okay, this scene's too long. Mm-hmm. You have to there needs to be a break here. There needs to be something. There needs to be a shift here of scene because people's
more than
attention
15
spans
seconds is avant-garde now.
Right. Like now it's like down to 5.
Yeah.
Like it's literally like goldfish brains. So it's it's something that I think that is an enemy of silence. It's really the whole bringing the circle back. Like that's an enemy of silence is the fact that we're even kind of wired a little bit differently. And I think, again, when you're trying to do God's work while you work for God, like that's part of, fighting back against that and taking just a few moments of just silence to just pause throughout your day. Because again, you get back into being, it's nice to say this now, we're still kind of at the tail end of summer. Although I don't know if you have to cut that because now I've like referenced time and date, and then it's totally going to throw off.
No, we recorded the end of summer. This will be coming out in a few weeks. I'm okay with that.
So, but once we get back into the school year, it becomes, especially for educators, you're just super busy. Mm-hmm. So, and I get it when you're in front of students, you're the first thing you're doing when you get a break is going to the bathroom, but like then you're doing all of those things that you couldn't get to the night before or the morning of. So again, I know that me saying carve out a few minutes is almost, we talk about heresy. It's almost like heresy to an educator, like, a few minutes. But it really, again, if you schedule that time and you schedule just start small with that little practice, it becomes easier to do God's work while you're working for him. So I would throw the question back now. I'll podcast host for a second.
Yeah, I like this.
I mean, because again, this is you working here at Studio 316. You're doing God's work. Like, do you find that when you like a lot of times when people leave the office, they want to leave their work at home. Like, this is the type of, and this is maybe what I mean by that. This is the type of work you don't leave it in the office.
Yeah,
you might not be podcasting at home, but you're probably thinking about it when you get home. But there might also be times where you're just like, I don't want to think about work right now.
Yeah.
So do you find yourself ever, having a hard time getting psyched up about your prayer life when you get home because you've just spent all day talking about other people's prayer lives?
I have a hard time getting psyched up about my prayer life in general. That's been an issue of mine for a while. But in terms of here, I do think there's a luxury of working here that we still do pretty normal worky job things. Of like, a lot of my job is still calling clients, doing product demos, like, and it's all it's all baptized, like you're saying. But I think I almost have the opposite, where I do forget that what I'm doing is spiritual work, because like, I mean, particularly I think what I do here, for those at home, I always joke, I do whatever I'm told. I don't really have one job, and some things are a little more clear. Like when I'm talking to a principal about their school, it's clear the spiritual implications of our conversation, especially on like a product demo or like a podcast. But I also do shipping stuff sometimes, or I also book travel. And it's very hard for me while I'm doing those things that feel more monotonous and less spiritual to remember that it's spiritual, to remember that what I'm doing is work for God. It just starts to feel like it's regular work, and it happens to be spiritual if I look at it from some roundabout angle. But I definitely take for granted that I work at a Catholic company, for sure. Like sometimes I forget that I'm allowed to go to work and openly talk about my faith and mass and prayer life. And I mean, the fact that at any time in any day, if I told my boss here is effectively Billy Joe, if I ever told Billy Joe, hey, I'm going to go pray for 15 minutes, unless I'm on a meeting with a client, there's no world where he would be like, no, don't do that. You have to keep working.
And how often do you take advantage of that?
Ooh, great question. 4 times ever? It's crazy. It's like I take it for granted so much. But I'm sure if someone at a secular job, their boss told them that, they'd take it every second, because it'd be special. It wouldn't be a regularity anymore.
And that is kind of my whole point with all of it, is that I think we all take for granted the fact that we work, in Catholic education in an environment where we could take, like you said, if you couldn't have those 15 minutes,
then I'm sure I'd want them more than water.
Right. Exactly. So those are some of the ways that I think that we sometimes do take advantage of the fact that we're in a field where we do work for God, because we end up just thinking that it's just work. Like it's just, I've got, regardless of the field. I mean, surely teaching, there's a little more vocational intent there, but it's still, you get in the same rut of plan the lesson, teach the student, do lunch duty, grade papers, plan the lesson, teach the student, do lunch. Like it's its own routine. So it's very easy to forget that even in I think even in a public school, it's easy to forget that you're impacting lives. I mean, and that is the work that educators do. I mean, they, regardless of whether you are in public, private, secular, Christian, Catholic, like you are impacting the lives of children.
Cool. Well, so Nick, as we're coming up on the end of our time here, we've about 10 minutes left, give or take. We're not going to like cut it off, but what would be Nick Tanis's 3-step, 5-step, 10-step, whatever step program or list of how to do God's work while working for God well?
I knew you were going to ask this question, yet I still didn't prepare very well.
That makes it so much more fun of a question
to answer it. Because
you can take some time and think about it too. If you want to take 30 seconds of silence, I'm okay with that. We can cut it out, or we can leave some silence in here. I was thinking about ending this podcast with a minute of silence, just for a little meta commentary there.
I thought about that too. I was like, how well does silence work in a podcast environment where it's almost like, I mean, I imagine that if you hit like, right, if it was like 3, no, not 3 would be way too long, but like even 15 seconds of silence, how many people would look down at their device and be like, did I accidentally, someone calling me? Did it hit the pause button?
I thought about stopping talking and seeing how long it would take for Kat to look up at me and be like, wait, did he fall asleep? She would never do that. She would never make eye contact.
Well, and I think some of the any hesitancy on my part, or like, what are Nick Tanis is what this. It's really that my wife will listen to this and be like, you are so full of crap.
You can let her know that if she wants to make an addendum, it'll be in the description.
And then my coworkers would also be like, well, let me really tell you what Mr. Tanis is. No.
Yeah, we're going to have another.
It's hard
I'm going to corroborate all the advice you were giving.
It's hard to feel like you're an expert in prayer. I mean, we are all, I'll say whatever whatever I do say, we are all practicing.
Sure.
So I would say the very first thing is to be more aware of the opportunities you have working in an environment where you can freely express your faith.
Okay.
Like that is the first thing, which is really a terrible step, because telling someone to be more aware of something is not easy. It's not practical. It's like, oh, well, I can start tomorrow by being more aware.
Yeah.
Like there's no real, we're talking about using more verbs. there's no verb there. It's like there's a helping verb. So I would say probably really my first step would be, and it is an actionable step, is schedule time for silence.
Okay.
Schedule time for silence.
Schedule time for silence
in your day. So that would be
step one.
That would be step one.
Step one is that. It reminded me what you were saying of a quote that my spiritual director told me that his spiritual director told him, which is, pray as you can, not as you can't. If you're a teacher throughout the day and what you can do for prayer is 30 seconds of silence, then do that and be happy with that. Don't be upset that you're not doing a holy hour. Don't pray as you can't. And that was what you were saying, reminded me of it. Like praying with what you're able to do in front of you. Don't think you should do a holy hour but only do 30 minutes and all this comparison and all this stuff. Just pray as you can, not as you can't. If the way you can pray during your school day is 7 alarms that you ignore 5 of them and do it twice, then pray as you can. Like, pray as you're able to in the position the Lord has put you in. It's not an accident that that's how he's calling you to pray at that time in your life for that 8-hour day at your job.
I like that one. Pray as you can.
Not as you can't.
Not as you can't. Like that. I'm going to quote that one too.
Okay,
like
cool. You can just quote me. Don't even worry about it. We're 3 generations deep. Now it's mine again.
So I think scheduling the time.
Okay. Step one, schedule time for silence throughout your day.
Yes. Number 2, like anything you do at the pool over the summer, or if you've ever been to summer camp, buddy up. Find a buddy. And
Okay.
I don't think that necessarily means that you have to pray with the buddy, but find somebody at your workplace, or find a friend, find a family member that can help hold you accountable. Because I think with a lot of the things that we do, if we don't have a sense of accountability, it's easy to backslide. So if it's just, hey, I'm committed to doing 30 seconds or, a minute in prayer, can you just check in on me? It is just having that little bit of accountability is something that you can do. I think that will help keep you committed to your prayer life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and keep building that progress.
Correct.
Yeah, progress. It's gained in drops, lost in buckets. That's a Billy Joe quote that he quoted from someone else, probably James Clear. Yeah. So, okay, schedule time for silence throughout your day. Check. Well, not check, but do that. Step 2, get an accountability partner. Keep you
find a buddy
on this track. Find a buddy.
Find a buddy. What do we would call them Noah's Ark buddies when we do field trips.
Wow, that's fun.
Get your Noah's Ark.
That's really
buddy.
fun.
And so, when you're at the pool, you just like the high five when they hit a buddy
awesome.
up to make sure everybody
When
was
you
there.
said that, I imagined on Noah's Ark, since it was like, we'll probably cut this in, was one guy and one girl animal. I just imagined you standing next to you in a wig, and it made me chuckle. This made me really happy.
Find my sister, then that's
Yeah.
like me in a wig. She will say the same thing, which is frightening for her. So I think it's okay. So we talked about the scheduling the time, finding your Noah's Ark buddy, and again, it's not necessarily it's not as actionable as those first 2 steps, but it's offering your sufferings to God. And I think that is something that is important, I think, for us to try. I think if you've done the first 2, then you might find it a little easier throughout the day to offer one thing up to God. As I think as we get into the school year, and if again main audience is our teachers out there, the things and maybe that's ahead of time, the things during the school year that are going to frustrate you. So it's, if you can start off with the intention to say, okay, I know I'm eventually going to get a request by my administrator to go to a meeting that I really don't want to go to. And when I do, I'm going to say, God, I offer this suffering to you, then again, start your school year that way, then you might be able to, suffer through it for a purpose and not waste that opportunity to let the Lord do something for you in your life while you're suffering through that first meeting.
Yeah. I love that. Okay. So now we're up to 3. We're up to schedule time for silence. We're up to get a buddy, and we're offering up our sufferings. Then do we morph into Nick? Do we become Nick Tanis? Can
Absolutely
we?
not.
Can I?
No.
Okay.
You have to. I used to say I'm not turning over a new leaf. I'm turning over like a new pine needle because I'm constantly changing what I'm doing. It's like rolling.
That's awesome.
Like a needle. But it's is finding those opportunities within your workday that you can take advantage of the fact that, again, most of us work in a space where we have access to the Eucharist. We have access to adoration. We have, we can take 10 minutes to do a walk. It would be, if you're scheduling your time, if you're finding a buddy, if you're offering up sufferings, it's finding something on your campus or at your workplace that maybe you haven't thought about discovering before as a way to enhance your prayer life.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I think that's a very nice 3-step, put a bow on it, express shipping from Nick Tanis to whoever is listening. Yeah, it's beautiful.
I, wish all of our educators out there, all of our students that are getting ready to go back to school, that they have a blessed school year, that they find ways that they can glorify the Lord. And for all of our educators out there, understand that everything that we do throughout each and every day is to bring our children closer to God.
I love that. Beautiful. All right, we're going to clap at the same time to close it out. We are out.